Amy had always considered herself someone who was guided by empathy. To her, kindness wasn't just a choice but a core part of who she was. She believed in the ripple effect of small acts of compassion, and that one kind gesture could make someone's entire day better. But one afternoon, that deep belief in kindness would come at a cost. It was a cold, dreary day, and Amy was working the afternoon shift at the local cafe, her usual routine comforting in its predictability. The coffee shop had always been a busy spot, a place where regulars came to chat, study, or simply grab a quick cup of coffee. As Amy moved between the counter and the tables, she noticed a man sitting outside on the sidewalk. He looked worn, older than his years, with unkempt hair and a tired expression. His clothes were ragged, and his sign read, "Veteran. Anything helps." Amy had seen him a few times before, always in the same spot, his sign resting against the curb, his eyes following the crowd of passers-by who mostly ignored him. It struck her every time, how people would avoid eye contact, keep their heads down, or pretend they didn't see him. Amy couldn't understand how anyone could ignore someone in need. Her heart clenched as she watched the man quietly, almost resigned, sitting in the cold. Her break came, and without giving it a second thought, Amy stepped outside. Her stomach churned with nervous energy, but she pushed it aside. This was the right thing to do. She approached the man slowly, hesitating just for a moment. "Hey there," she said gently, her voice soft yet firm. "I've got a sandwich and some coffee from inside. Would you like that?" The man looked up at her in surprise, his face softening. He nodded gratefully, his voice cracking as he said, "Thank you. You're the first person who's offered me anything today." Amy smiled, relieved to see that her small gesture had made a difference. She gave him a few dollars as well, unsure if it would help but knowing it was something. The man's eyes teared up as he clutched the change in his hand, muttering words of gratitude. But just as Amy was about to turn and go back inside, she noticed her manager, Greg, standing in the window, his arms crossed. His face was hard to read, but Amy couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Greg stepped outside, his gaze fixed firmly on her. "Amy, can I talk to you for a second?" Greg's voice was flat, his tone authoritative. Amy's stomach sank. She had never seen Greg so serious before. "Sure, Greg," she said, her voice betraying a slight tremor. "You can't be giving away food like that," he said, his eyes cold. "It's against company policy. We don't have the resources to just hand out free meals. You're creating a distraction." Amy's heart skipped a beat. She tried to explain, but her words felt weak against the weight of his disapproval. I thought he might need something. It's just a sandwich." Greg didn't seem to care. "It's not just a sandwich, Amy. You're not running a charity here. You can't just give away things whenever you feel like it. People come in here to buy, not to get handouts." The words stung, each one like a sharp blow to her chest. Amy's face flushed with embarrassment, and a mix of frustration and confusion bubbled up inside her. She was trying to do something good, something simple, and yet it felt as though Greg was more concerned about the bottom line than the well-being of another human being. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, lowering her gaze. She couldn't bring herself to argue. She just wanted to shrink away, to forget this moment. The man outside had meant nothing to the business, but to Amy, his small glimmer of hope had meant everything. The next day, Amy was called into the office. She was told that her actions were not only against company policy but had caused a disruption that could not be ignored. Despite her good intentions, the company simply couldn't afford to have employees undermining the rules. Amy felt the words sink deep into her chest. She had been fired for doing something she believed in. Walking out of the office, her heart heavy, Amy couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. She had spent so many years believing that kindness mattered, that helping others was something that should be celebrated, not punished. But in that moment, her kindness had been met with indifference, even disdain. Days passed, and the weight of it all still lingered in her mind. Amy found herself questioning her own values. Had she been wrong? Was it foolish to act on impulse, to try to help someone when it didn't align with the rules? She thought of the man outside, how his face had lit up when she helped him. He might have forgotten her by now, but Amy knew that, in that moment, she had given him something that couldn't be measured by dollars or policies. As time wore on, the bitterness didn't fade. She still believed that kindness was worth fighting for, but now she knew that sometimes, it came with a price. And yet, despite everything, Amy couldn't bring herself to regret her decision. The memory of the man's smile and the sense of rightness in her heart was more valuable than any paycheck or job security. She had acted out of compassion, and that was something no one could take away from her. The encounter with the homeless soldier was a moment that would forever change Amy's perspective on the world. It wasn't a grand or dramatic event, but it was one that planted a seed in her heart, a seed that would grow even as the consequences of her kindness began to unravel around her. It all started on an unusually cold afternoon. Amy, having worked her shift at the local coffee shop, stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The city was bustling with the usual rush of pedestrians, but Amy's attention was drawn to a man sitting on the sidewalk near the corner of the street. He wore a tattered army jacket, and his face was lined with exhaustion and sorrow. He had a cardboard sign in his lap that read, "Homeless Veteran. Anything helps." His eyes, though tired, carried a quiet dignity, and he looked up at people passing by with a faint, yet hopeful expression. Amy's heart ached at the sight of him. He was so familiar, a fixture in the neighborhood. But for some reason, today, he seemed different. His eyes met hers, and there was a brief moment of connection, one that made Amy's heart twist. She couldn't ignore him. She had seen him before, but today, something stirred inside her, a deep sense of empathy, perhaps even a bit of guilt. The world had moved on, leaving people like him behind, while everyone else rushed about their daily lives. Amy had often wished she could help, but now, looking at this soldier's tired eyes, she knew it was time to act. Without thinking too much, she entered the coffee shop and quickly made a sandwich and filled a cup with hot coffee. It wasn't much, but it was something. She couldn't help but think that even the smallest of gestures might make his day a little less unbearable. She gathered the items in a small bag and, without a word, walked out to him. The chill of the wind hit her skin, but it didn't matter. The look in the man's eyes, his deep sadness and quiet resignation, pushed all of her discomfort aside. As she approached him, she tried to steady her hands, her heart beating faster now that she was close. "Hi, would you like some food?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words seemed simple enough, but there was something in them, something real, that made the man pause. He looked up at her with cautious surprise, as if he couldn't believe someone was offering him something without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough, barely audible. "That means more than you know." His hands trembled as he took the sandwich and the coffee, and Amy couldn't help but notice the small tear that glistened in the corner of his eye. It was then that she realized just how deep the weight of his situation ran. Amy felt a rush of emotions. There was something deeply moving in the simplicity of this exchange, something that made her chest tighten. She smiled faintly, wishing she could do more. But for now, this small gesture was all she had. The man thanked her again, and as Amy turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had done the right thing. She had made a difference, no matter how small, in this man's life. However, the moment was quickly overshadowed by a bitter reality. When Amy returned to the coffee shop, she was met with an icy stare from her manager, Greg, who had been watching her from the window. His face was stern, and his posture was rigid, as if he were bracing for something. As Amy stepped inside, her heart sank. She knew something was coming. "Amy, I need to talk to you," Greg said, his voice devoid of warmth. She followed him to the back of the shop, where he crossed his arms and eyed her with an expression that was anything but friendly. "What's going on, Greg?" Amy asked, her stomach churning with apprehension. "You can't just go giving food to people on the street like that," Greg said coldly. "This isn't a charity, and we're not in the business of handing out free stuff to every person who asks for help. You're causing a disruption, and we can't have that here." Amy's heart skipped a beat. She had expected criticism, but this felt different. It felt harsh and unjust. "I didn't mean to cause a problem," she replied, her voice trembling with frustration. "I just wanted to help someone who needed it." "Is that really so wrong?" Greg didn't soften. "It's not about what's right or wrong. It's about what's appropriate for this business. We don't give things away for free. People come here to buy, not to get handouts." Amy felt the words hit her like a slap. She didn't understand. How could helping a man who was clearly in need be seen as a disruption? How could something so simple as offering a sandwich be wrong? The confusion and hurt overwhelmed her, but she swallowed the lump in her throat. She wasn't about to argue with him, it wasn't worth it. The next day, Amy was called into the office. The air was heavy with an unspoken tension, and when Greg informed her that she was being let go, Amy felt her world collapse. She couldn't believe it. All because she had done something kind, she was losing her job. She tried to hold back her tears, but it was hard. She had always tried to do the right thing, and yet, here she was, facing the consequences of her actions. "Your decision to give away food, Amy, has caused too many issues," Greg said, his voice final. "I'm sorry, but we can't keep you on anymore." Amy didn't know what to say. She was angry, confused, and devastated all at once. She walked out of the coffee shop with her head held high, but inside, her heart was broken. She had lost her job, yes, but she had also gained something else. She had gained the understanding that sometimes, doing what is right can come at a price. She knew she had acted from a place of kindness, and that would never be taken away from her. As Amy stepped into the chilly street, she could still feel the warmth of the man's grateful smile in her heart. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Even if the world didn't always understand, she knew that kindness, however small, was never truly wasted. It was something that would always remain with her, no matter where life took her next. Amy never imagined that a simple act of kindness could cost her everything. The events of the day weighed heavily on her as she walked back to the cafe after helping the homeless soldier. She had felt so sure of herself in the moment, she was proud of what she had done. She had been moved by the soldier's story, his eyes empty of hope, his situation desperate, and for once, she had acted without hesitation. She gave him food, water, and a moment of dignity. It felt right. But little did she know, it would all come crashing down. When she walked into the cafe later that afternoon, the atmosphere felt off. There was an uneasy quiet in the air. Her co-workers, usually chatty and full of life, were eerily silent, their eyes avoiding hers. Amy's heart began to race. It wasn't like her colleagues to act this way, and it didn't take long for her to realize that something was terribly wrong. Her unease deepened as she made her way to the manager's office, feeling an unsettling pressure in her chest. The door was already slightly ajar, and Amy hesitated before stepping inside. Greg, the manager, was sitting at his desk, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface in front of him. His face, usually friendly and warm, now looked cold and unreadable. She could feel the tension in the air as she stood in the doorway, waiting for him to acknowledge her. "Come in, Amy," Greg said finally, his voice flat. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, the click of it sounding louder than it should. Her stomach twisted in knots. The silence between them felt suffocating. Greg didn't waste any time. "I've been made aware of what happened today," he began, his tone distant, like he was addressing a problem rather than a person. "And I need to be clear with you, Amy, this behavior is not acceptable here." Amy's breath caught in her throat. Her mind raced, trying to grasp what was happening. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly, though she tried to maintain composure. "I just helped someone in need. I didn't think it was a big deal." Greg's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something hard and unyielding in his gaze. "It is a big deal," he replied. "You can't just go around handing out food to people like that. We're a business, not a charity. Customers come here for a certain atmosphere, and you disrupted that. You made people uncomfortable. That's not acceptable." Amy's mind raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Disrupting the atmosphere? She had simply given someone food. She wasn't sure how to respond. The words felt foreign coming from Greg. She had always admired how he ran the cafe, how he treated everyone with respect. But now, he was speaking to her as if she had done something wrong. The betrayal stung more than she could have imagined. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," Amy said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. She felt small and vulnerable in that moment, like she was being reprimanded for something that should have been praised. "I just wanted to help." Greg leaned forward, his expression hardening. "Helping isn't the issue here. It's about how it affects the image of the cafe. And right now, you're jeopardizing that image. You're a part of this team, Amy, and you need to act accordingly. This isn't a place for charity work." The words cut through Amy like a blade. She had never felt so misunderstood. She had given so much of herself to this place, but now, it felt like none of it mattered. Her heart sank as she realized what was coming next. "You're fired," Greg said, the words hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Amy froze. She couldn't believe it. Fired? For being kind? She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. What could she say? How could she explain that helping another human being should never be seen as a problem? But she couldn't find the words to defend herself. Her mind was too clouded with confusion and hurt. Greg didn't look at her with empathy. Instead, he remained cold and indifferent, like he was delivering an inevitable verdict. "You can leave now, Amy. We're done here." As the words sank in, Amy felt a mix of emotions overwhelm her. Anger, disbelief, and sorrow all collided inside her chest. How could she be punished for trying to do something good? The injustice of it all felt suffocating. She stood up, trying to steady herself, her hands trembling as she gathered her things. The finality of it hit her all at once. She had lost her job, the one thing that had given her a sense of purpose in the past year. But more than that, she had lost something deeper, her belief in the world's capacity for kindness and understanding. Walking out of the office, Amy felt like a part of her was being left behind. The hum of the cafe, the chatter of her coworkers, all seemed distant now. As she stepped outside into the cold air, the weight of her emotions hit her like a physical blow. She stood there for a moment, not sure where to go, unsure of what to do next. Tears welled in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to break down in the middle of the street. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? But now, all she could feel was a crushing sense of loss. She had hoped for a better world, one where compassion was valued, but now she had to face the harsh reality. Sometimes, doing the right thing came at a cost. As Amy walked away, her heart heavy and her future uncertain, she couldn't help but wonder, was it all worth it? Would the world ever understand the importance of kindness, or would it always be overshadowed by profit and perception? The last 24 hours had been a whirlwind for Frank, a roller coaster of emotions, realizations, and actions that he never expected to experience. What had started as a simple day, like any other, had evolved into something far more profound, something that had changed the very core of who he was. It all began with that moment, when Frank was walking down the street, rushing to his usual cafe for his morning coffee. He was already irritated, distracted by the demands of his day and the usual weight of his responsibilities pressing on him. That was when he saw her, Amy, standing outside the cafe, talking to a man who, at first glance, looked like he had nothing left. His clothes were worn and ragged, his face weathered by years of hardship, and his posture slumped in a way that suggested years of disappointment and despair. Frank couldn't help but feel a pang of discomfort as he noticed the soldier's state, but it was Amy's actions that really caught his attention. Without hesitation, Amy had reached into her bag and pulled out a sandwich, offering it to the man. Her face was gentle, kind, without a shred of judgment, despite the man's disheveled appearance. She smiled, talked to him for a few minutes, and even laughed at something he said. Frank watched, still standing across the street, almost paralyzed by the sight. The man was a stranger, a homeless soldier, someone society had turned its back on. But Amy didn't seem to care about any of that. She simply treated him like a human being, with compassion and respect. There was something in that moment that stirred something deep inside Frank. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but he knew that what he was witnessing was rare, and perhaps even beautiful. There was a sense of guilt that washed over him as he watched her, guilt because he had passed by so many people in his life, people who needed help, and he had never once thought to stop, to offer a hand. But what truly shocked him was when, after the soldier had thanked Amy and walked away, Amy turned to leave as well, but then stopped. Frank's heart skipped a beat as she looked right at him, her eyes locking onto his. She didn't look surprised, or ashamed, or even annoyed. Instead, she just looked hopeful. It was as though she was silently challenging him, urging him to do something, anything, to take the same step she had taken. To care, to act, to reach out. He stood frozen for a moment. His mind raced, his heart beat faster. There was this tension, this inner conflict. He had always been too busy, too focused on his own life, too caught up in his responsibilities to think about anyone else. But in that moment, the walls he had built up around himself started to crack. Amy's kindness had reached into the deepest parts of him, places he hadn't even known existed. He realized, with a jolt, that he had been living with blinders on. It wasn't just about his work, his career, his goals, there was more to life than that. Without fully understanding why, Frank walked up to the soldier, who was now sitting on a bench nearby, looking lost in thought. His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his pocket and pulled out the few bills he had, more than he usually carried with him. He offered them to the soldier, who looked at him, confused. I saw what she did," Frank said, his voice faltering. "I thought, maybe this could help." The soldier blinked a few times before his expression softened. He took the money, but not before offering a genuine, heartfelt thank you. Frank felt something stir inside him, a mixture of relief and awe. It was such a small gesture, and yet it felt like the most meaningful thing he had ever done. It wasn't about the money, it was about breaking the invisible barriers that had held him back for so long. As the soldier walked away, Frank felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had done something good. Something real. For the first time in ages, he didn't feel like he was just going through the motions of life, but actually living it. That evening, as he sat at his desk, his thoughts kept circling back to the events of the day. His mind was racing with a mixture of emotions, guilt, confusion, but also a growing sense of hope. He felt like he had finally woken up from a deep slumber. There was so much more to this world than he had realized. He wanted to help more people, to do more than just sit idly by and watch the world pass him by. Just as he was lost in these thoughts, his phone buzzed. It was a text from his father. Frank stared at it for a moment before he read the message. "I heard about what you did today. I'm proud of you, son. You're starting to see things differently, The words hit him harder than he expected. His father had always been critical of him, demanding more, expecting more. For years, Frank had felt like he could never measure up. But this simple acknowledgement from his father, it felt like a validation he had been craving for so long. It was as though his father was telling him, without saying it directly, that he had finally made a change, that he was becoming the man he had always hoped he would be. The realization was overwhelming. In just one day, Frank had gone from being someone consumed by his own problems, trapped in the monotony of daily life, to someone who was starting to understand the importance of kindness, of human connection. He had witnessed Amy's compassion and, in turn, had acted on it. And now, he felt like he was standing on the precipice of something new, something bigger than himself. As the hours passed, Frank felt his priorities shifting. He no longer cared so much about the mundane struggles of daily life, work deadlines, bills, the things that had once seemed so important. Instead, he felt drawn to help others, to make a difference, however small it might seem. He wanted to be like Amy, to be the kind of person who acted without hesitation, without fear of judgment, someone who saw the humanity in others and responded with care. When Frank woke up the next morning, he didn't feel the weight of his old anxieties. The world outside seemed brighter, and he felt a sense of purpose, like a flame had been ignited within him. He wasn't just living for himself anymore. He was living for others, for the connections he could make, for the ways he could help, and for the person he was becoming. In just 24 hours, Frank had changed. He had seen the world through a new lens, and with that shift came a renewed sense of direction. His life would never be the same again. The arrival of the military unit in town was like a shockwave, disrupting the routine of Frank's quiet life. For weeks, he had been coasting through his days, oblivious to the greater world beyond his immediate concerns. His small cafe, his daily habits, and the routine of his work were enough to keep him comfortably numb. He had long ago learned to avoid any situation that might challenge his perceptions or bring attention to the hidden corners of his own soul. But now, as he watched the military unit roll into town, he was caught off guard by the intense ripple it sent through him. It all started on a normal afternoon when a soldier entered the cafe where Frank was sitting, nursing his coffee. Frank had noticed the soldier immediately. There was something about him, something oddly familiar. The soldier was sharp, dressed in uniform, but Frank's eyes lingered on him. He could swear he had seen this man before. Then it hit him, this was the same person Amy had helped just a day ago. The transformation was almost jarring. The disheveled, homeless figure he had seen before had now been replaced by someone with a posture of authority and an air of confidence. But there was something else, too, something unspoken in his eyes that made Frank feel uneasy. Amy, always perceptive and quick to understand the weight of a situation, saw Frank's troubled gaze and walked over to him. There was a brief moment of silence before she quietly spoke. "You know who he is, don't you?" Her tone wasn't accusatory, but there was an underlying sadness in her voice, as if she already knew the answer. Frank, still processing the sight of the soldier, nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember him from yesterday. He was the one sitting on the curb. But now, he's one of them. A soldier." Amy let out a soft sigh, her eyes never leaving the soldier. "Yes, he's a soldier. But his story goes much deeper than that. You see, Frank, that soldier's journey didn't begin with a uniform. It started long before that, in places most people would never understand." Frank's heart tightened at her words. He didn't understand. He wanted to. But the reality of it all felt too big, too complicated. How could someone who had been homeless, broken, be standing there now, so composed, so real? It wasn't just the soldier's transformation that confused Frank, it was the fact that he hadn't even seen the humanity behind the uniform, behind the struggles of someone like him, until this moment. Amy saw the confusion clouding Frank's expression and knew this was the moment when everything would change for him. "Frank," she began, her voice firm but gentle, "you've been living a life of avoidance. Avoiding the realities that are right in front of you. You've built walls around yourself, pretending that what happens outside your little world doesn't matter." Frank felt a lump rise in his throat, the weight of her words sinking in. He had spent so much of his life not caring, not engaging, convinced that his small world was enough. It had been easier that way, to look away from the suffering, to pretend that nothing existed beyond his own comfort. But now, as Amy's words hung in the air, he felt like a fool. He turned his gaze back to the soldier, watching him for a long moment. Peter, as Frank later learned his name was, had a quiet strength about him, a strength that seemed to reach far beyond the uniform. The soldier's eyes, though weary and filled with the shadows of his past, carried something else now, something Frank hadn't seen before in his own life: resolve. The kind of resolve that comes from fighting for survival, from overcoming obstacles that most would have collapsed under. Amy stepped closer to Frank, speaking quietly, almost like she was reading his mind. That soldier was just a man. A man who had nothing, who lost everything, but he fought to get it back. The only difference is, he knows what he's fighting for now. Frank's chest tightened. He could hear Amy's words, but they were still abstract, not yet fully sinking into his soul. What did it mean to truly fight for something? He had been so focused on his own life, his own choices, that the thought of fighting for someone, or something, beyond his own needs had never occurred to him. He didn't know what it was like to truly care for someone else's story. The idea felt foreign. Peter walked past them, his footsteps steady, but Frank could feel the silent weight between them. Peter's glance was brief, but it was loaded with meaning, as if he had seen through Frank's indifference, as if he knew exactly what Frank was thinking, knew what he had been running from all this time. "Are you going to let it go, Frank?" Amy's voice was soft, but Frank could hear the challenge in it. "Are you going to keep turning away, pretending none of this matters, or are you going to face it?" The words hit Frank like a wave crashing on the shore, washing away everything he had believed to be true. He wasn't a passive observer in this world. He was part of it. He couldn't hide in his cafe, behind his routines, anymore. The man he had seen on the street, the soldier, Amy, they were all parts of a much bigger story than the one Frank had been telling himself. He had been a part of that story all along, but he had refused to see it. "Do you want to know the truth about me?" Peter's voice interrupted his thoughts. Frank looked at him, startled. Peter stood there, waiting for Frank to answer. His expression was no longer the hardened exterior Frank had expected. Instead, it was vulnerable. "I wasn't always this way. I wasn't always a soldier. I was lost. Homeless. But then someone saw me. They didn't look away, didn't pretend I wasn't there. They helped me. They gave me something more than food or shelter. They gave me a chance." He paused, his eyes locking onto Frank's. "And I want you to have that chance, too. To see things for what they really are." Frank stood there, unable to speak, feeling the weight of Peter's words pressing against his chest. He had spent so many years avoiding the truth about the world, about himself, and about others. But now, in this moment, it was impossible to deny the reality that had always been around him. The appearance of the military unit, and of Peter, had shaken something deep within Frank. No longer could he continue to live in ignorance, shielded by the walls he had built. No longer could he deny the humanity of those around him. He knew, in that moment, that his life was about to change forever. The invitation from the military took Frank completely by surprise. He had been living a quiet life, tucked away in his cafe, avoiding the world outside. It was a life of safety, routine, and quiet reflection. The weight of his past was still heavy on him, but he had learned to carry it, to numb the ache. And yet, this one letter, delivered without warning, shattered the fragile sense of calm he had built for himself. It happened late one evening when the cafe was winding down. Frank was wiping down the counter, lost in his thoughts as the dim light from the hanging lamps cast long shadows across the room. The quiet was comforting, almost therapeutic, and he had come to appreciate the stillness of the space. Then, the door creaked open, and he looked up to see Peter standing in the doorway. Peter looked different this time. No military uniform, no commanding presence. Instead, he wore plain clothes, yet there was something about him that still carried that same quiet authority. The lines on his face seemed deeper, and his eyes, though kind, held an intensity that was hard to ignore. Frank felt an unease settle in his chest. Something about this visit felt different. "Frank," Peter said with a calm, steady voice. "We need to talk." Frank nodded, setting down the rag he had been using, his hands suddenly clammy. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he sensed that this conversation would change everything. Peter took a step forward, pulling out a thick, official-looking envelope from inside his jacket. "I've got something for you," Peter continued, his gaze unwavering. He handed the envelope to Frank, who took it slowly, almost as though it weighed a ton. It was sealed with a wax emblem, and Frank could feel the weight of the decision contained within it. For a moment, he just stared at it, his thoughts racing, before finally tearing open the seal. Inside, there was a letter written in formal, military script. Frank's heart began to pound as he unfolded it, the paper rustling in his hands. He wasn't sure why, but the sense of dread that had settled in his chest earlier now seemed to intensify. The letter was brief, but it carried a power that was undeniable. Frank, the letter began, "We have been observing you and have seen the qualities that define a true leader. Your ability to rise above adversity, your compassion, and the strength you've shown in moments of crisis, all of these things have not gone unnoticed. The military is extending an invitation for you to join us, to be part of a team that stands for something greater than any one individual. We believe you have the potential to make a real difference. This is an opportunity for you to grow, to lead, and to find a purpose beyond the life you've known. Asterisk. Frank's eyes lingered on the words, his mind struggling to grasp their full meaning. The invitation wasn't just an offer, it was a summons, a call to arms that Frank hadn't asked for, but one that seemed to be directed at him nonetheless. He had spent years running from responsibility, avoiding anything that would force him to confront his past, his pain. And yet, here it was, an opportunity to step into something new, something bigger than himself. It was the exact thing he had been avoiding, and yet it felt strangely like the thing he needed most. He looked up at Peter, his hands trembling slightly as he held the letter. "I don't know what to say," Frank admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I've spent so long trying to avoid my past, avoiding anything that would push me forward. I'm not sure I'm the man you think I am." Peter stepped closer, his expression softening but still firm. "I understand that you have doubts, Frank. I can see the weight you carry. But what I'm offering isn't a way to escape that weight, it's a way to confront it. This isn't about erasing your past, it's about using it. You have qualities that make you unique, and I believe you're ready to face the challenges ahead." Frank's mind spun with the possibilities. He had always thought of himself as an outsider, a man who didn't belong in a structured world. The military life felt foreign to him, order, discipline, sacrifice. These were concepts he had never truly embraced. But now, with the weight of the letter in his hands and Peter's unwavering gaze on him, he began to wonder if perhaps he had been wrong all along. The decision wasn't easy. The fear of change was suffocating, and Frank could almost feel the pull of the familiar life he had created for himself. But there was also something else, something deeper, an undeniable yearning to find purpose, to make sense of the life he had been given. The military wasn't just a job, it was a chance to redeem himself, to prove that he wasn't just running away from his past but that he could rise above it, become something more. "I need time to think," Frank said, his voice quieter now, the weight of the decision settling on him. He wasn't ready to make a choice yet, but the invitation was there, and it demanded to be considered. Peter nodded, as if he had expected this answer, and placed a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Take all the time you need," Peter said gently. "But remember, Frank, you've been given an opportunity that few ever get. This is your chance to change not just your life, but the lives of others. When you're ready, we'll be here." As Peter left, Frank stood there, the letter still clutched tightly in his hands. His mind was in turmoil. The quiet life he had known was slipping away, replaced by the daunting, unfamiliar future the military offered. But for the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a spark of hope, of possibility. The invitation was a door, one that could lead him into a world he had never imagined, but one that held the promise of redemption, of growth, of a chance to make a difference. Frank wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: the decision he had to make was no longer about running away from his past. It was about stepping forward into something that could transform his life, and perhaps even the world around him. The invitation had been extended, and now, the only question was whether or not he had the courage to walk through that door. Amy had never imagined that one single week could turn her life upside down. A week ago, she was reeling from the shock of being fired from her job, a devastating blow that had left her feeling worthless, uncertain, and hopeless about her future. The abrupt dismissal, especially after the kindness she had shown in helping a homeless veteran, seemed like an unjust punishment. Her manager's cold words echoed in her mind, "Your actions go against the company's values." It didn't make sense to Amy. After all, she had only tried to do what was right, to help a person in need. But now, without a job, she had been forced to confront the harsh reality of her situation. Her savings were running thin, and the future felt like an overwhelming void. But then, out of nowhere, came a call that would change everything. Amy was in the middle of her routine, aimlessly searching for new job opportunities online, when her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, and her heart sank, unsure of what to expect. It turned out to be Rachel, a representative from a local veterans organization. The organization had heard about Amy's compassionate act, her decision to help the homeless soldier, and wanted to offer her a position. They were looking for someone to manage their outreach program, a position that would involve helping veterans who had fallen through the cracks of society. As Rachel spoke about the role, Amy's mind raced. This wasn't just any job offer. It was a chance to make a tangible difference, to stand up for those who had given everything in service to their country, only to be abandoned in their time of need. Amy listened intently, trying to process what Rachel was saying. She had never worked with veterans before, never been in a position to help people in such dire circumstances, but there was something deep inside her that stirred at the thought. It felt right. The veterans had served their country, and now, they needed someone to fight for them in a different way. Her heart beat faster as she realized that this might be the fresh start she had been searching for, a chance to rebuild her life, but also to be a part of something far greater than herself. Still, Amy hesitated. She was frightened of failing again. The rejection from her old job had shattered her confidence. Would she be able to rise to the occasion? Would she be good enough for this role? It felt like such a big responsibility, but after a few moments of reflection, she made a decision. She would take the job. The fear of failure seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of truly helping someone in need. She owed it to herself, and to those veterans, to try. The first day at the Veterans Organization was a whirlwind of emotions. Amy had braced herself for the challenges of the role, but she wasn't prepared for the overwhelming feeling of urgency that filled the air. The office was small and humble, adorned with military photographs and memorabilia that spoke volumes about the lives and sacrifices of the men and women who had walked through the door. Amy was introduced to the veterans who frequented the place, many of them in dire need of assistance, some suffering from physical wounds, others from the unseen scars of war. As Amy interacted with them, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of sorrow for all they had endured. Their faces spoke of pain, not just from the battles they had fought overseas, but from the battle to survive on the streets of their own country. It was a sobering realization. These weren't just statistics. These were people with names, stories, and dreams that had been crushed by circumstances beyond their control. And it wasn't just their wounds that troubled her, it was the feeling of abandonment that seemed to seep through every interaction. They had been left behind, ignored by a society that owed them so much. In that moment, Amy felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. This wasn't just a job. It was a calling. As the days passed, Amy threw herself into the work. She was involved in organizing events, reaching out to local businesses for donations, and coordinating volunteers who shared her passion for helping veterans. But what stood out the most to her was the one-on-one interactions with the veterans themselves. Amy took time to listen to their stories, no matter how difficult or painful they were to hear. She met men and women who had served their country with pride, only to return home to a life of uncertainty and struggle. Amy had never before felt so connected to a cause, and the more she listened to their stories, the more determined she became to help. One veteran, in particular, stood out to Amy, Robert, a Vietnam War veteran who had spent years living on the streets. Robert's weathered face and hands bore the marks of a life hard lived. Amy learned that he had been deeply affected by the horrors of war and had spiraled into a cycle of addiction and despair upon his return. But despite his rough exterior and the walls he had built around himself, Amy could see something different in him, a flicker of hope, a small part of him that was still trying to fight. She knew that Robert had given up on himself long ago, but she refused to give up on him. Over the following weeks, Amy worked closely with Robert. She helped him find a place to stay, connected him with medical care, and set up appointments for therapy. It wasn't easy, there were setbacks, and there were days when Robert relapsed into his old habits, but Amy never wavered. She kept coming back, kept showing up, because she believed in his potential. It wasn't just about getting him off the streets, it was about helping him rediscover his dignity, his purpose, and his sense of worth. One afternoon, as Amy and Robert sat together, sharing a quiet moment in the office, he turned to her and said, "You've changed my life, Amy. I never thought I'd see the day when I could start over. But here I am. I don't know how to thank you." Tears welled up in Amy's eyes. She had helped many people in her life, but this was different. This wasn't just a job, it was her life's work, her reason for being. She had found her purpose in a world that had seemed so dark and uncertain just a few weeks ago. Through her work, Amy learned that it wasn't always the grand gestures that made the biggest difference. Sometimes, it was the quiet moments, the ones when you listened, when you believed in someone when they no longer believed in themselves, that mattered the most. And as she continued her journey with the Veterans Organization, Amy realized that the job had done more for her than she could have ever imagined. It had given her a new sense of direction, a new sense of hope, and most importantly, a sense of belonging. She wasn't just helping the veterans find their way, she was finding her own path along the way. After Amy accepted the job at the Veterans Organization, her life began to transform in ways she never could have anticipated. What had once felt like a dark, uncertain time filled with confusion and self-doubt, now slowly started to take on a new purpose. Each day, she woke up with a deep sense of responsibility and urgency that she hadn't felt for months. Her mornings, which had once been filled with dread and aimless drifting, were now filled with a sense of anticipation. Despite the early hours and the emotional weight of her job, Amy felt an undeniable pull to her work. She could no longer deny the powerful connection she had with the people she was helping, and the sense of duty that grew within her with every passing day. The job wasn't easy. Helping veterans reintegrate into society was a complicated, exhausting task. But there was something profoundly fulfilling about it. She worked with men and women who had served their country, who had sacrificed so much, and now found themselves struggling with trauma, addiction, and homelessness. Amy could see the desperation in their eyes. She could feel their anger and frustration, but she also recognized the quiet hope that lingered beneath their hardened exteriors. There were times when she felt overwhelmed by their pain, but her resolve never wavered. She couldn't help but feel that in some way, their struggles mirrored her own. She had lost her job, her confidence shattered, but just like them, she was fighting to regain her sense of self-worth. One veteran, in particular, made a lasting impression on her, Frank. Frank was an older man, a soldier who had seen it all. His eyes told the story of years spent on the front lines, and yet, despite the battles he had fought in the military, he was now facing an even greater battle, surviving on the streets. Frank was a man who had been deeply let down by the system, by his comrades, and by society. He had no faith in anyone, least of all someone like Amy, who was just a stranger trying to help. But Amy, despite his resistance, saw the humanity in him. She knew that the walls he had built around himself were a defense mechanism. She could tell that beneath his tough exterior was a man who was just as broken as she had felt when she lost her job. Amy made it her mission to break through his walls, to show him that someone cared, even if he didn't believe it yet. At first, Frank pushed her away. He'd snap at her, ignore her, or try to change the subject, always shifting the conversation away from anything that might make him vulnerable. But Amy didn't give up. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and she accepted that she couldn't fix him overnight. But every time she spoke to him, every time she helped him take small steps forward, she felt something shift inside herself. It was as if by helping him, she was also healing her own wounds. Slowly, over time, Frank began to trust her. He would show up for appointments, albeit reluctantly at first. Amy celebrated the small victories, the first time he accepted a meal from her, the first time he agreed to speak to a therapist. These were monumental moments in Frank's journey, and in Amy's own journey as well. It wasn't long before Frank was able to secure temporary housing. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start. Amy could see the change in him. He wasn't as angry anymore. He had a bit more hope in his eyes. And that was all the proof Amy needed to know that she was doing something right. This work, this job that she had taken because she needed to pay her bills, had become something far more significant. It had become her calling. She realized that helping others, offering them a sliver of hope, had given her the very same thing in return. Her life outside of work was also changing. Her friends, once worried about her well-being and constantly asking if she was okay, started to notice the difference in her. She wasn't the same person who had been fired from her last job, unsure of her future and full of anxiety. Amy was beginning to feel a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. Her confidence, which had been shattered after her dismissal, was now slowly rebuilding itself. It was in the small moments, when she was able to make a real difference in someone's life, that Amy began to see her own worth again. The job was tough, draining, and at times heartbreaking, but it gave her purpose. It gave her something to wake up for every morning. Amy's transformation wasn't just about her career, it was about her emotional and mental growth. As she continued to work with the veterans, she saw how their resilience inspired her. Many of them had faced unimaginable hardships, lost everything, and yet they were still fighting. They had a strength that Amy envied, but it was also a strength that she came to understand. They had to fight, because if they didn't, they would lose themselves completely. And Amy understood that fight because she had been fighting her own battles, against doubt, fear, and the weight of her own past mistakes. When Frank finally moved into permanent housing after months of work, Amy couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just a victory for Frank, it was a victory for her too. She had helped him regain something precious, his sense of dignity. In that moment, as Frank stood in front of his new home, Amy realized how far she had come. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was thriving. She was making a real difference. And in the process, she was healing. The change in Amy didn't go unnoticed. The Veterans Organization began to rely on her more and more, giving her additional responsibilities, recognizing her leadership and dedication. Amy had found her place, not just within the organization, but within herself. The work she was doing was no longer just a job, it was a part of who she was. And for the first time in a long time, Amy knew she was on the right path. The process of healing, both for herself and for the veterans she worked with, was ongoing. But Amy no longer felt lost. She knew that she was exactly where she needed to be. Helping the veterans gave her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known in years. She no longer saw them as people just in need of help, she saw them as people with stories, with resilience, and with strength that inspired her every day. And through them, Amy discovered that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope, always a chance to rebuild. Amy sat nervously in the cafe, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she glanced at the clock. She had arrived early, a habit she had formed over the past few months of working with Frank. He had called earlier in the day, asking to meet, but his voice had sounded different, more subdued than usual. She could sense the weight of something significant hanging in the air, and her stomach fluttered with a mix of anticipation and concern. Frank had come a long way since their first meeting. She remembered how he had been when they met, a man defeated, his eyes dull with hopelessness, his clothes ragged, his mind clouded by alcohol and memories that kept him from moving forward. She had seen him at his lowest, and somehow, she had stayed by his side. At first, it had been about helping him find the basic necessities, a place to sleep, meals, clean clothes. But as time passed, their relationship had grown into something more profound. It had become about rebuilding his sense of self-worth, about teaching him that he wasn't defined by his past or the mistakes he had made. Now, months later, Frank had made progress. He had stayed sober for weeks, something he hadn't thought was possible, and had begun attending therapy. He was even enrolled in job training, something he once believed was out of reach. Frank was learning how to rebuild his life, and Amy had been there every step of the way, offering guidance, patience, and, most importantly, belief. She had come to see him not as a project, but as a man who had a second chance, a man who, deep down, wanted to change. As she waited, Amy's thoughts were interrupted by the soft chime of the cafe door opening. She turned to see Frank walking in, his usual hesitant gait replaced by something else, an uncertain but determined stride. He had shed his old, worn-out jacket for something more fitting, a simple, clean coat that hung loosely over his shoulders. His hair was trimmed, and his face, while still showing signs of hardship, had a new air of hope. When his eyes met hers, she saw the familiar vulnerability, but also something different, a sense of pride, small but undeniable. Frank walked toward her, and as he sat down, Amy noticed his hands were shaking. Not from fear, but from something more profound, nervousness, perhaps, or the weight of the moment. Amy tried to hide her concern, offering him a smile, though she too felt a twinge of uncertainty. Something significant was about to happen, but what it was, she couldn't yet say. "Hey, Frank," Amy said softly, her voice steady but her heart racing. "What's on your mind?" Frank took a deep breath, his eyes momentarily drifting to the floor before locking with hers. "Amy, I've been thinking a lot," he started, his voice low. "About everything. About where I was when we first met and where I am now. I don't know how to say this, but I just want you to know how much you've done for me." Amy's heart swelled with a mixture of warmth and unease. She had never expected Frank to be the type to express gratitude easily, but this was different. His words felt heavy, as though they carried the weight of everything he had overcome. I never thought I could be where I am now," Frank continued, his voice gaining strength. "I was lost, Amy. I was so deep in it that I couldn't see a way out. But you believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And you never gave up." Amy opened her mouth to speak, but Frank raised his hand, signaling her to wait. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled envelope, sliding it across the table toward her. The envelope was simple, but something about it felt monumental. Amy's breath caught in her throat as she reached for it. She hesitated, unsure of what was inside, but she felt a sense of anticipation building in her chest. With a careful motion, she opened the envelope and pulled out a certificate. At first glance, it appeared to be a formal recognition of Frank's progress, an achievement from the veterans organization that had been helping him along the way. But it wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of everything Frank had worked for, everything he had endured, and everything he had become. Her hands trembled as she read the words aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "Certificate of Achievement, for sustained sobriety and dedication to personal growth." She looked up at Frank, her eyes wide with surprise. "Frank, this is incredible. You did it." Frank's eyes glistened, his lips curling into a hesitant but proud smile. "I did. And I couldn't have done it without you." Tears welled up in Amy's eyes as she placed the certificate back on the table. She had never imagined seeing this moment. She had believed in Frank, yes, but to witness his transformation, to see the man before her who was no longer defined by his past mistakes, was something she hadn't expected. It was a quiet victory, one that felt as much like her own as it did his. "I'm so proud of you," Amy whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You've come so far, Frank. This is just the beginning, you know?" Frank nodded, a soft laugh escaping his lips. "Yeah, I know. It's still a long road ahead. But for the first time in a long time, I think I'm ready for it." The two of them sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past and the hope for the future settling around them like a quiet understanding. Amy knew that Frank's journey wasn't over. There would be setbacks, challenges, and hard days ahead. But today, right now, was a moment of triumph. A moment that proved to both of them that change was possible, that people could rebuild their lives, and that sometimes, all it took was someone to believe in you. As Frank stood to leave, he reached out and placed his hand on hers. "Thank you, Amy. Thank you for never giving up on me." Amy squeezed his hand, her heart full. "You did all the hard work, Frank. I'm just glad I could be there to see you through it." And as they said their goodbyes and Frank walked out of the cafe, Amy felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had helped a man rebuild his life, but in doing so, she had also found something invaluable within herself. She had found her purpose, her calling, and a reminder that, even in the darkest times, there was always a chance for change. Compassion, in its truest form, is one of the most transformative forces in human interactions. It transcends barriers and speaks to a deep part of our shared humanity. At its heart, compassion involves more than just feeling sympathy for someone else's suffering. It requires an active response, a willingness to do something, no matter how small, to alleviate that suffering. This powerful act of empathy can create life-changing moments, not just for those who receive compassion, but also for those who offer it. In many cases, we see how compassion creates a profound connection between people. It's not merely about a charitable gesture or fleeting kindness, it's about creating a bridge between two people's worlds. When someone acts compassionately, they offer something far more meaningful than material goods. They offer presence, understanding, and a sense of validation. For those who are often overlooked, whether they're homeless, struggling in silence, or going through personal turmoil, compassion can be life-altering. It affirms that they matter, that their pain is seen, and that their lives have value. Take, for instance, a person who has been living on the streets for months, perhaps even years. They've encountered the cruelty of indifference, the harshness of being ignored by passers-by, and the weight of isolation. But one moment, one simple act of kindness, a warm meal, a comforting word, or an invitation to talk, can make a world of difference. It's in that moment that the person is reminded that they are not invisible, that someone sees their suffering and is willing to offer help. This act of compassion does not just soothe their immediate discomfort, it has the power to restore their dignity, reignite their hope, and remind them that there is goodness in the world. Moreover, compassion does not simply end with the recipient. When someone witnesses or experiences an act of compassion, it often stirs something within them, a desire to pass it on, to engage in similar acts of kindness. This creates a ripple effect, one that spreads through communities, workplaces, and families. It's a contagious force, drawing others into a cycle of empathy and care. When compassion becomes part of a larger social fabric, it can transform an entire environment. Consider a workplace where compassion is not just a buzzword but a daily practice. Imagine a manager who recognizes the emotional burden of an employee, not just their professional performance. Instead of reprimanding them for a missed deadline or a mistake, the manager offers understanding and support. This act of compassion, taking time to listen, to understand, and to offer solutions, shifts the employee's perception of their work environment. It creates a space where vulnerability is met with kindness rather than judgment. The employee feels valued as a human being, not just as a cog in the machine. This sense of validation can reignite their motivation, increase their commitment, and ultimately improve their performance. In return, the company benefits from a loyal and engaged employee, and the cycle of compassion continues. But compassion is not just about improving individual relationships. It has a profound impact on the broader societal structure. In a community where compassion is prioritized, people are more likely to support one another during difficult times. When individuals see that they are part of a network of care, they feel safer, more secure, and more likely to invest in the well-being of others. Compassion fosters an environment of trust, one where people collaborate, share resources, and lift each other up. This, in turn, creates stronger communities and more cohesive societies. It's a space where individuals feel that their well-being matters, not just for themselves, but for the collective good. In some instances, this collective power of compassion can lead to tangible changes in society. Acts of compassion can highlight systemic issues, like poverty, mental health, or homelessness, that need to be addressed. They can challenge societal norms and push for policies that advocate for the vulnerable. By shining a light on the struggles of others, compassion often becomes the driving force behind social change. It brings attention to the marginalized, amplifies their voices, and demands justice for those who have been left behind. However, offering compassion requires more than just an emotional response, it calls for action. It is not enough to simply feel sorry for someone's plight. True compassion means actively engaging in the process of healing, whether that's through offering financial support, dedicating time to volunteer, or advocating for structural changes in society. In the workplace, this might mean creating policies that promote mental health and well-being, ensuring that every employee has access to the resources they need. In a community, it might involve organizing food drives, providing shelter, or creating safe spaces for those in need. Compassion is a delicate balance of vulnerability and strength. It requires stepping outside of one's comfort zone to listen without judgment, to offer help even when the solution seems unclear, and to be emotionally present for others in ways that can be draining. Yet, the rewards are immense. When we offer compassion, we not only impact others' lives, but we also experience a sense of fulfillment and connection. It brings meaning to our lives, reminding us of the importance of empathy, kindness, and selflessness. The true power of compassion lies in its ability to change the course of lives. It has the ability to lift someone from despair, to ignite hope in the face of hopelessness, and to create a ripple effect that can transform entire communities. Compassion creates the foundation for a more just, equitable, and connected society, one where people are not just existing alongside one another, but actively caring for and uplifting each other. In a world often clouded by division and negativity, compassion serves as a beacon of hope, reminding us of the extraordinary impact that kindness and empathy can have on both individuals and the world at large.